What's up, gamers? Welcome to the most budget-friendly, tankiest life build in Path of Exile 2. This is the Molten Blast Bloodmage Melee Bleed Witch. I have completely fallen in love with the Bloodmage Ascendency because it offers some of the best defense and recovery in the game. The reason this character is so tanky and why I dare call it the Immortal Life Bleed Mage Witch is mostly due to two Ascendency points. The free one you get as soon as you start a Blood Mage, and then Grasping Wounds, which is the first point that I would allocate on a hardcore character. Life Remnants, which you get as soon as you ascend to a Blood Mage, are some of the coolest recovery mechanics available in Path of Exile 2. Life Remnants, which is the effect that Sanguincy gets you as soon as you allocate it, will leave drops of blood every time you hit an enemy. These drops of blood can be picked up, giving you flat more life, and also an insane amount of recovery whenever you pick up a blood globule. And while a lot of my focus on this Ascendency is purely defensive, the Ascendency offers an insane amount of offensive well, specifically Blood Barbs, which is the node that we are building our clear around. What this node does is that it makes elemental damage contribute to bleeding magnitude. So the fire damage from Molten Blast will now contribute towards bleeds. And so while we're clearing maps, we're just holding down our Molten Blast button, getting huge bleeds on mobs, creating huge bleed pops, thanks to Herald of Blood along with Herald of Ash, making our clear so smooth. The blood globule effect, in addition to Grasping Wounds, which makes it so 25% of life loss from hits is prevented, and then instead just added on to a recovery effect after the damage is applied, makes your character one of the tankiest life-based characters in the game right out of the gate without having to worry about any other defense. These two together are some of the best feeling nodes in Path of Exile 2. And finally, the last Ascendency points are both brand new to the class as of 0.3, and while definitely don't define what this character does, offers really nice bonuses that just provide a little bit more oomph to our offensive capabilities in our altogether incredibly tanky Blood Mage package. Please subscribe. I want to prove to my mom that this isn't a waste of time, and the more subscribers I get, the more evidence I have, so please subscribe. So I want to prove to you that this is an incredibly budget-friendly build that you can get up and running in with under a divine easily. The reason being is that the uniques are incredibly common and not that desirable from other people, and our build is life-based. And life gear isn't that wanted by a lot of the other top-end builds, so you end up getting really good items for incredibly cheap. And just to prove, let's check the price of Cloak of Flame. This is on the hardcore server, and so if you're playing on softcore, I bet these prices are even cheaper. And while some people are listing them for divines, you could see you could pick this up for a few exalts. The other unique we're using is the Hollow Mask, which is literally a 1 exalt unique. And you can even end up picking a pretty nice corruption. Again, incredibly cheap, right? You pick up some free accuracy rating with 1 exalt, right? So these are incredibly cheap uniques that a lot of our defense is built around that you can get for incredibly cheap. You also don't have to spend a lot of currency getting a weapon that you can easily start clearing T15s with. I bought this for 10 exalted as soon as I hit maps, and it's like a 500 P DPS weapon. Now, granted, the attack speed is pretty nice, and it does have some lightning damage, but the point is, you can pick up a weapon like this incredibly easily as soon as you start hitting maps. And this was the weapon that I was using in the beginning footage of those clips, especially on those maps when you saw me clearing issue with no issue whatsoever and just blasting through mobs. So you really do not need to spend a lot on a weapon either to immediately start feeling incredibly clear. And this is the weapon that I ended up crafting myself. By no means is this going to be my end-all weapon, but the point is it's not that hard to get your hands on a really high fizz damage weapon. And the cool thing is, or not necessarily a cool thing, because it does limit our overall damage capabilities, but it's nice that we don't have to worry about plus to melee skills on our weapon, because Molten Blast doesn't scale with plus melee skill because it doesn't have a melee tag. So ultimately, you're not going to get more damage from a weapon that has plus melee skills, which just makes the overall acquisition of getting a weapon a little bit easier for us, which is nice. I'll go over quickly the rest of my gear and just point out some really important details, especially on the shield and the hollow mask, that really amount towards a lot of the defensive capabilities that I think is a cool tech that I don't see a lot of other people using, especially other life-based builds, which is stacking the additional physical damage reduction modifier. So this mod right here is a really insane modifier to protect you against big fizz hits, which are by far and away the thing that is going to be most responsible for killing your character in endgame maps. And the reason the flat additional physical damage reduction stat is so good is because it ignores armor checks. So regardless of how much armor you have, your character will just take a flat 15% less damage from fizz hits if you equip this item, which if we're talking about a fizz hit that hits you for something like, oh, I don't know, 10,000 damage, you're going to need like 50,000 armor to match the amount of physical mitigation that this one line of stat is going to give you based off how the armor formula currently works in Path of Exile 2. And we could stack that stat with a few more items as well. You see another 5% additional physical damage reduction on our shield. This is really the only other source that we're getting it from, giving us a flat 20% additional PDR from hits, meaning that we are more tanky on big fizz hits with 1,200 armor than characters who have 50,000 armor, which is an insane stat and really a dig on how bad armor is, especially in the late game. But if you're able to find works around with these kinds of gear, you can still make an incredibly tanky life-based character. The real source of our defense prowess, though, is coming from the Cloak of Flames, because 40% of physical damage taken, we just take as fire damage instead. Being able to use elemental resistances as the main source of mitigation against a physical hit is one of the most overpowered defensive mechanics in Path of Exile. And these items are incredibly cheap, as I just showed, and incredibly powerful. So I would highly recommend, if you're doing any kind of build, especially if it's a life-based build where you're not just trying to stack as much E as possible, to really consider using items like this, because you are going to be wanting as much physical damage reduction as possible when you get to endgame maps. And the only really way to get hits, to be able to survive hits from like 5,000 plus fizz, is to mitigate that damage somehow, and armor isn't going to cut it, so you're going to need other sources of mitigation. And whether it's stacking additional PDR or converting the physical damage to fire, it's really the only other way your character can survive and be immortal outside of stacking a bunch of freaking ES. The rest of my gear is really basic. We're just trying to maximize resistances. Again, chaos resist being the big thing to try to max, especially in hardcore. And that's where a lot of the expensive items come from on our character from currency point of view, is just trying to maximize chaos resistance. And if you're playing on softcore, that's not really something you have to spend a whole lot of time worrying about. So again, this gear is going to be even cheaper if you're someone who mostly just plays on softcore, which I imagine the large majority of the population does. But hey, try hardcore. So now that I've shown you the gear that we have on and the mechanics of how our defense work from our Ascendency, I want to prove to you from a math point of view that what I'm saying isn't just a load of BS. So this is our character in POB, and I know the text on the left-hand side of the screen might be a little bit hard to read here, but I want to draw your attention to the Fizz max hit. You can see our current Bloodmage has a Fizz max hit of 9.3k. And the only amount of POB magic I've done is I have configured to plus 1,000 life, because our sitting life in a map is closer to 3,900 than it is 2,600 because of the blood globule effect, which POB does not currently account for. But if we do remove the plus 1,000 life, which we do have whenever we are mapping or bossing, you'll see our Fizz max hit is still pretty much around 6.8k. Now, let's compare that Fizz max hit to two other builds that you might be familiar with. So this is Quinn's Titan Thorn build. His whole build was designed around stacking as much armor as possible. And with 20,000 armor, his Fizz max hit is 4.6k. So if you ignore all of our overlife mechanic, our Fizz max hit is still almost twice as much as Quinn's, whose whole build is stacking as much armor as possible. Another example I want to show you is Ziz's build. Ziz literally just got a one-shot by a rare mob who had a physical attack. Why did he get one shot? Because he has 3.6k Fizz max hit. So really, the point of endgame mapping defensively is to try to build a character with as much Fizz max hit as possible. And Ziz and Quinn are not tourists. They know what they're doing in Path of Exile. And the point is, it's incredibly hard to build around a big Fizz max hit. The only way that people are doing it outside of what I just showed you on my Bloodmage is what Alkaiser is doing with his Invoker. Alkaiser is mitigating 0 physical damage and is relying 100% on just stacking as much ES as possible to tank the Fizz hits. You see, his energy shield is 14k, his Fizz max hit is 14k. He has literally 0 mitigation and is just stacking ES as his answer to Fizz max hits. And this is definitely the meta strategy for making your character as tanky as possible, is just stacking as much ES as you can. The reason it's so effective is because you can just get a bunch of ES nodes on the tree that give you % increase in EHP, which isn't an option that life characters have. The only source of % max life on the tree is like this node, which you need at least 10 support gems to like even get the trigger of, and then like this node, which is like 3% increased life. Meanwhile, ES characters get entire wheels of ES scaling. So the ES to life comparison is really brutal at the moment because of how much scaling is available to energy shield characters. But as you can see, our character is still able to work around that downside and still be a life character with a really respectable Fizz max hit to ensure that we don't get one shot by the same things that was killing Ziz and Quinn's character. So I'll now go over the gem setup and how we're dealing damage on a character like this. And I'll preface this section with saying that if you're mostly a softcore player or you're someone who thinks a lot about dealing damage, I bet you can find a lot of optimizations in this section. I've really only applied my brain power to making my character as tanky as possible. I'm sure there are a lot more offensive things that we can be doing that I haven't really tapped into, just because I'm not sure that they exist, or it's just not really been my focus. I've really been trying to focus on survivability and tankiness, not so much on damage. So if there are things that I'm going over, which you're thinking, oh, I can include this and be doing so much more damage, that you're probably right, and you should probably try it out and let me know, because a lot of my energy and brain power has been spent on just trying to maximize defense, and I'm sure there's a lot of things I could be doing on the damage front that I'm currently not. So I'm just going to preface this section with that for all you softcore gamers out there. So our life remnants is, again, the thing that is giving us so much EHP, and very basic setup. I mean, there's things you get if you go to the support gems. Literally one of the only support options to support on this thing are these things. So that setup speaks for itself. The Molten Blast setup. So additional projectiles is super important on Molten Blast because unlike a lot of the other abilities in this game that fire multiple proj, this one can shotgun. So especially on mobs that have kind of big character models or bosses, you can end up shotgunning with this ability if you have a lot of projectiles. So the multi-shot aspect of this is really potent. And Molten Blast itself has a unique modifier if you are dual wielding, which will fire twice as many projectiles. So the shotgun capabilities of this damage output is really insane. The one downside with that is, unfortunately, like, shotgunning doesn't really matter for bleed, which is where a lot of our damage is coming from. And, you know, dual wielding is inherently a less survivable and less defensive option than using a two-hander with a shield. So I've opted for the lower DPS, higher survivability option. But if you're a softcore player, I think I would try a kind of two-handed one-hand mace, or sorry, yeah, a dual-wielding one-hand mace variation, and seeing how far I can get with that. Just because it should offer a lot more damage because of the extra projectiles, which will be shotgunning, which is an incredibly potent combo. Again, I'm stacking some attack speed. If you have enough attack speed and you're using one-handers, you probably don't need this. But just because there is that wind-up ability from Molten Blast, it will feel clunky if you don't have some kind of source of attack speed and skill speed while you're mapping. So this is why I include this. But if you have enough on other pieces of gear, you can just drop this gem for more damage. The bleed node here is something that I thought I would be able to replace easier. But ultimately, I've had a pretty tough time figuring out how to get 100% chance to bleed, you know, easily, just with the tree and soul cores. There is a soul core that you can have that gives you a plus 15% chance to bleed, but ultimately I find that I would have to invest so much around getting chance to bleed nodes on the tree that it was really hard to kind of min-max round. But I'm sure there are people that are able to get this to just 100% chance to bleed without using this gem, letting you just put another damage socket in here. So that's just something I wanted to point out, because I think at the very, very high end, you definitely do not need this node, this gem. Fire Pen is just something I've, again, I think it's really helpful, because being able to completely ignore fire resistance on a attack that is converting, you know, all of our damage to fire damage pretty much, especially with the shrapnel, is really potent. And while some mobs have 0% fire resistance, so this is kind of a wasted gem slot against some of the mobs in the game that just have 0% fire resistance, it's helpful enough against like rares and enough of the blue mobs that do have enough resistances that I do like running it. I've tried running without it, and you kind of do feel a little bit ZDPS against certain mobs that have resistances. So it is a nice node to have, just in terms of making the clear feel smooth throughout. And then Fire Attunement. This just ended up giving me more damage than weapon elemental damage. And so it's just a damage node. Again, if you are someone who is just focused on dealing damage, you don't really care about your defenses, you can probably find a much more optimized setup, but this is what I'm currently working with, and it works for me just fine. Hammer of the Gods is where a lot of our single target is coming from. And again, kind of a just janky setup with whatever I think makes the most sense. I'm using the 100% chance to bleed node just because we don't have that inherently with the tree and the martial soul core passives. So we have to get our chance to bleed from the support gem, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. And then we're just stacking a bunch of damage, you know, whatever it is. It's pretty basic. The Infernal Cry is, you know, again, another pretty basic thing. I do like having the second wind ability, just so if you're facing big backs of mob, you can, especially during abysses, you just hit your Abyssal Cry into a Molten Blast and your entire screen will explode. So it's a really nice thing to have, even though the empowered attack will not apply to Molten Blast. So the empowered attack will not do any more extra damage on your Molten Blast. It'll just make the mobs explode. But you can empower your Hammer of the Gods attack. So it's still a really nice thing to have. And for certain bossing combos, hitting the Infernal Cry into the Hammer of the Gods is a very potent combination. Bone Shatter is something that I'm currently using in place for a better spear option. There is a spear gem. I forget exactly what it's called, but essentially it like makes the bleeding on mobs explode, and you know it just works really well with bleeding, but you need to have a spear. And I've had a lot of trouble getting my attributes to a place where I can easily equip a spear, given that I am using Giant's Blood. Which just means that, you know, my setup is probably not really min-max around doing as much damage as possible, because I do think there is a lot of opportunity for a spear weapon swap to get the bleed to explode the bleed procs that you're putting on enemies. But because I've just found that a little bit clunky on hardcore, I don't want to be losing a shield and trying to get another shield so I can switch with my spear and still having a shield out. It's just been a little bit of work to get going. So I've just been using the mace option, which is Bone Shatter, and this is just to help get more valor and glory for Hammer of the Gods proc, a really unimportant aspect of the build that I might just swap out for a Leap Slam anyway. Bloodhound Mark is how we're generating stuns on bosses, because this means that our blood loss is going to contribute towards heavy stuns. And when you put this on a boss right before Hammer of Godsing it, for instance, you're going to immediately proc into another stun, which gives you another Hammer of Gods proc. So you can go Bloodhound Mark, Hammer of Gods into another Hammer of Gods because of this gem, which is really nice and potent. Herald of Blood is where the only kind of lineage support gem I'm using is currently allocated for. And again, this is a super cheap gem. You can get this for 1 egg on any server, I'm sure. And we're just getting some nice armor break off our Herald of Blood procs. It's kind of our only source of armor break outside of this passive here, which gives us just certain amount of armor break on targets that have ailments on them, which all of our enemies do. So, armor break's not a huge aspect of our build, but it's nice to have for our clear in some aspects. And you do notice it, especially if you are fighting like an Abyss. You have your Molten Blast, you immediately pop all of the white mobs on the screen, and the rare mob part of that pack is now have broken armor, and so one more cast will just kill it. So it is a really nice combo to have, and I would recommend this kind of setup. Blasphemy is really important because cursing mobs is a huge aspect of the build for 2 reasons. First off, bleeding we inflict on cursed targets is aggravated, meaning that the bleed DPS will act like it's moving, and when mobs are moving, you get 100% extra bleed damage. So you always want to have a curse up on targets. And Blasphemy also works with this node, meaning that if we're just walking around a map with our Blasphemy aura, mobs have 15% less life because this works with Blasphemy, which is a really cool tech. And again, it's not so much offense. There's a lot of other Ascendencies have nodes that deal a lot more than 15% more damage, but still, it's a nice little thing to have when we're already cursing all of our mobs anyway, and the other Ascendancy options aren't that useful for us. So it's nice. And finally, we're using Overwhelming Presence just to get a few more glory procs. You could totally drop this since I now have this allocated. Both of these last spirit points, Herald of Ash and Overwhelming Presence, are not necessary. You can definitely optimize around other kind of spirit setups, but just what I've been playing around with and having some amount of success with. And so the last thing I want to go over before we start hopping into a map real quick to show off the build is the passive tree. So I immediately started playing as a melee witch and just dove into the left-hand side of the tree. What we just tried to focus on is damage, since the tree doesn't really give you any kind of defensive options. And our damage comes from the source of these nodes stacking increased damage with two-handed weapons. Nodes like this, which increase the magnitude of ailments, as well as just magnitude of ailments, essentially, as well as these, which is increase attack damage, and getting a bunch of strength on the tree to accommodate our build for Giant's Blood. I found that Giant's Blood is still an incredibly potent node, even though inherent life granted by strength is half, which sounds a lot worse than it actually is. If you look on POB, which Giant's Blood currently doesn't work on, you would see if I didn't have Giant's Blood allocated, I would have 2,800 life, but because I do, I have 2,600 life. So I lose 200 life, but I gotta equip a shield, which is kind of a game changer. Just having a flat 26% block with the new block changes, which is really nice, as well as just the other kind of aspects of having a shield. Like I get 2% max chaos res, another source of chaos resistance, just making the overall gearing a lot easier. And I get to stack the additional PDR mob, meaning that I'm overall way tankier for having a shield than I would be without it. So even though the Giant's Blood notable got hugely nerfed in the last patch, I still think it's worth it. This node is also a new thing they added last patch that I think is really nice for a build like this, which isn't getting the most stun procs in the world. It's not like we're leap slamming into packs of mobs generating huge amounts of stun. So we do have a little bit of a glory problem for being able to proc our Hammer of Gods, which is a lot of where our single target embossing damage does come from. So being able to have pretty much permanent uptime with this does feel really nice, and is definitely a useful pickup. But I don't know how much you need it if you want to just ignore this entire section of the tree, which I think I would if I was playing on a softcore character. And finally over here, again, just stacking more bleeding magnitude, a little bit of proj damage. This node gives us some armor break, which is nice. More bleeding magnitude, bleeding duration, bleeding magnitude, and just some stats to make our, Giant's Blood able to actually work. One of the big helpful things to make this setup much easier to accommodate as far as the amount of attributes you need is the 35% reduced attribute acquirements on weapon. If I didn't have that stat, I would need 489 strength to equip that. And it is a real pain in the ass to get like 500 strength on a character while also trying to fit in like a blasphemy setup and a bloodhound mark setup. You just kind of going to drive yourself crazy with a lot of the attribute requirements. So getting a reduced attribute requirement node or suffix on a weapon is actually really significant for just making your life a little bit easier when it comes to gearing and some of the tree optimizations you can make. Okay, so let's hop into a T15 map and see what this build is all about. Really hope I don't die on the recording of the map footage clip. But here we go. So this is going to be a voiceover now. I honestly thought about just doing another map because I wasn't that all impressed with how this build looked while clearing this map. But ultimately, I just wanted to show you an actual authentic experience of what playing this build is like. And I didn't want to like nitpick to find a super dense abyss pack mobs to get like some, cheap clips that just make it look like my build's much more potent than it actually is. Look, this is what the build looks like when it's mapping, and this is probably one of the more annoying maps that you have when you have a lot of kind of objects running in front of you. It's not that there's not that much density, so you're not getting huge bleed procs, but this is what the build looks like. And I'm totally aware that there are other builds that are a lot smoother when it comes to clearing. For instance, I was watching Ray's QT's kind of curse build, which is just has insane amount of cast speed, and one curse is clearing white mobs. This build definitely isn't that when it comes to clearing, specifically because you see the wind up of the Molten Blast ability. There is going to be just a certain amount of cast time for your clearing, which is going to put a certain constraint on the overall clear speed that we can output as far as what this build can do. But it's good enough. And honestly, I was always pretty happy with the offense, especially in these kind of abysses where you get these big packs of mobs. And the thing about this build that, again, really enthuses me and makes me, excited to play it more is how defensively capable the build is. The offense is still, not fully there yet, but you can see there's no means like lacking of DPS. And while on rares, you might have to cast your ability, 2 or 3 times, on Abyss rares, maybe 4 or 5 times. One blast should clear pretty much every white mob, and the amount of AoE you get from the shrapnel and explosions is really nice to feel when you do encounter huge density objects. So look, I know the clear isn't going to be the most montage-worthy clear that you've ever seen in your life, but this example is probably the most Rawdog I could share, and this is what the build is like, and you are able to mirror this exact output with an incredibly low budget. Pretty much all of the expensive items on my character are only expensive because they have chaos resistance and life on them. If you are playing softcore, you don't really need those things that much. So you can just immediately start doing this clear speed as soon as you enter T15s with a pretty mediocre weapon. So again, I know this clear isn't necessarily something that you would want to show off in like a montage clip of the most extreme builds possible in Path of Exile 2. But when you have this level of clear attached to a character who just doesn't die and has insane recovery, that's what I think makes this a really well-rounded build and what makes me excited to continue logging in and playing it. Thank you guys for watching. This has been my build guide for my Immortal Bleed Witch Bloodmage. If you like this kind of stuff, please drop me a subscribe. I'll be putting out more Path of Exile 2 content all day, every day. I'm really loving the new patch. I think the exponential progress that the Path of Exile team has been making is just nothing short of phenomenal, and I could not be more excited for the future of Path of Exile 2. So if you want to see more stuff like this, more Path of Exile 2 content, please subscribe, drop me a like, let me know what you're playing, and I'll see you next time.